All media is political in that it reflects the politics of the time in which it's created in. For all the films that came out after 9/11, for example, you can see echoes of that disaster reflected in the media itself. Now, tons of media in the 50s and 80s reflected the Cold War paranoia as it spiked in those eras.
Stop! Will you tell these fools I'm not crazy? Make them listen to me before it's too late!
70s films, by contrast, carry that sort of burnout people felt after Vietnam and during Vietnam. A nihilistic sense that nothing in this world mattered and that God himself had died. But one genre I think that best reflects the fears of any generation is horror. Horror cinema is a terrific mirror to the fears that we have, and many of these fears are rooted in politics.
You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter.
Oh, and Senator, just one more thing. Love your suit.
Politics, left wing, right wing, both are reflected equally. And I mean, it's an election year, and Election Day follows October, which itself has Halloween, so what better time to reflect on our personal fears of the world than by looking at a few horror films. Specifically, I want to focus on how conservatism appears in horror, both as reflected through leftist directors and as created by conservative storytellers. And yes, I am going to look at the positives and negatives of this. I'm going to try to be fair and balanced to both sides here, but I am going to be critical and I'm going to be critical. And a lot of these films I'm going to be discussing, I actually like, so keep that in mind. I feel like I should just get this out of the way now because it's going to come up in the comments if I don't bring it up. A few months ago, In Praise of Shadows released a video on conservative horror. Well, actually, no, that's not really what it was about, but that's what it was titled. It was more an attempt at criticizing certain figures in the horror community for perceived fence-sitting or pro-alt-right beliefs, but quite frankly, I don't feel good about that. I don't really want to do that. I don't want to criticize anyone in particular for their political beliefs, with a key exception, which we'll get to at the end. You'll know what I mean when we get there. I thought the video was going to go in an entirely different direction, and this video is kind of what I hoped the In Praise of Shadows video would be. But I'm also not going to pile on In Praise of Shadows in here. This is the only time I'm going to mention him, because I feel like enough people have already criticized that video, and this is not going to mention Wendigoon at all, because, frankly, I don't know anything about Wendigoon. I don't watch his content, really. I've watched a couple of his videos, that's about it. I'm no expert, and I have enough arguments with people online. I don't need another one on top of that, okay? Okay. Now, here's the thing. As someone who's on the left himself, it's easy for me to point at something and go, that's clearly made with a right-wing conservative mindset. Now, a lot of critics will just stop and go, that's bad because conservative. But that, to me, is a very boring way to examine and critique media. Because media that is made from a mindset that does not align with my own isn't inherently bad. Bad storytelling is bad. I think the reason why people do this so instinctively is because there's so many Christian pure flicks films that come out every year, and they're all generic and bad in the same way, and preachy, and just exhausting to sit through.
So that you fill in the papers I've just given you with 3 little words: God is dead.
I can't do what you want. I'm a Christian.
If you're not in that target demographic, you're not going to get what they're saying, and you don't care what they have to say. Horror, though, is a little more universal. For a baseline, let's establish what I mean when I say right-wing versus left-wing horror. Left-wing belief indicates that the current systems of power are flawed and thus need to be improved, whereas right-wing belief believes either that the system is good as is, or, alternatively, was better in the past, and we should go back to the past to get to some better previous version of ourselves.
Action News talked to other people in the school community in favor of the ban. They would not go on camera, but said they believe the books are inappropriate for kids. The 6ABC data team analyzed book bans across the country and found Pennsylvania is in the top 3 states for banning books.
That's frightening to me.
Mindy Freeman and her daughter worry about how the ban will impact other kids.
Now, I obviously align more with leftist belief. I think the system is flawed and needs to be improved. I don't think society was better in the past, especially for marginalized people. Now, for the average right-winger, you may think, oh, okay, that's an acceptable position, and I respect that. Or you may think, oh, that's terrible. I'm hoping, though, you engage with my argument in good faith, because I'm going to try engaging with these films' arguments in good faith and just point out, hey, here's what's going on. I'm sure that's very articulate of me. Now, there's two kinds of ways right-wing related anxieties manifest in horror. Either horror films present the fears the left has of the right, or horror presents the fears the right has about, well, anything. A great example of a left-leaning film that showcases the fears the left has of the right is The Stepford Wives.
Joanna! How could you do a thing like that?
The film focuses on a suburban town where the menfolk, tired of their women becoming feminist, decide to replace their women with robots that only know how to cook, clean, and make love. The film and novel it's based on center on a new married couple who move into town. And while the husband is won over by the town's men, the wife very quickly realizes that this town is bizarre.
A very modern suspense story from the author of Rosemary's Baby. The Stepford Wives, about what men can do behind closed doors.
The women are stripped of their individuality and personality in order to conform to a system that benefits men. They cook, they clean, they make love, and they do nothing but that.
Charmaine changed. Carol Van Zandt changed. She's changed! And stop telling me I'm crazy!
There's a very famous scene in Stepford Wives where the main character has a friend in town, and they're both like, this town's so strange. They go on a trip, come back, the friend's gone. And you know that she's gone. It's just a robot. There's no soul there anymore.
How could you do a thing like that? When I was just going to give you coffee.
It's an obvious political message. It's talking about how men strip women of autonomy and of individuality to conform to a standard that benefits them. It's no shock this film came out after a massive surge in second-wave feminism.
The women's liberation movement organized several groups to protest the Miss America pageant as a symbol of society's exploitation of women as sex objects.
It's the fear of turning back the clock, that the men will push against these progress that women have made and return to an era where men had it easier.
The National Woman's Party lobbies for the 26th Amendment to guarantee women equal rights under the law. That amendment would make women people in a legal sense for the first time.
And of course, there's a lot that's a valid fear for the time. This film came out in the mid-70s, and while some men in the 70s would see the past as some glory age where men were on top, women spent the entire decade pushing against that. The teens and young adults in the 70s had to witness their mothers having no rights. A woman could not open up their own credit card until, it's gotta be the 50s, right? Wait, 1974? A year before the Stepford Wives came out? That's when women could open up credit cards? Oh my god. Yeah, so women even then were fighting for basic rights that we take for granted today. 1973 saw Roe v. Wade, a decision that gave women autonomy over their bodies for about 50 years until the Republican Party stacked the Supreme Courts and minor courts in a decades-spanning attempt to undo the clock. They pulled the Stepford Wives on the entire country.
Justice Stephen Breyer arguing that Alito's ruling is based on nothing more than the fact that 3 new justices appointed by Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, cast decisive votes to overturn Roe. Neither law, nor facts, nor attitudes have provided any new reasons to reach a different result than Roe did. All that has changed is this court.
That's clearly an oversimplification, and it's a complicated issue. But it's an oversimplification that feeds well into the fears we see reflected in media. After all, media doesn't have to be a one-to-one recreation of reality in order to present the fears people have of reality. There's a lot of films that today are now branded as woke or part of the DEI agenda, but whatever that means. But surprisingly few horror films get lambasted with these very oversimplified arguments. Films like The Purge are unsubtle in their politics, but are consistent when talking about the issues. Class disparity, how political powers use minorities as scapegoats for their agendas. The wealthy exploit the poor, and while those films are unsubtle, they have been praised and beloved by a large audience. even an audience that might not agree with the politics presented therein. There's Jordan Peele's films, which are consistently fantastic, peak horror. There's the original Candyman and its requel.
Seemed like you didn't quite get it.
No, I get it. It's the hood, gentrification, etc.
Artists gentrify the hood. Who do you think makes the hood?
And even though some people pushed against Chucky being more explicit with its queer representation, once the show came out, people stopped complaining and people started loving Chucky. Even those who thought it was going too gay, which is shocking, considering Don Mancini, the creator of Chucky, is in fact a gay man, lifting from his own life experience when writing Chucky.
I started injecting kind of LGBTQ content into the franchise, starting with Bride. It was a great opportunity to give young gay fans representation and to see themselves on screen in a way that I wasn't able to when I was 14 or 15 years old. And, you know, it's also write what you know, right? So a lot of what Jake is going through in the show is stuff that I experienced and lots of gay guys experience. I think hopefully it's a little better now, but we certainly have a long way to go.
Again, I digress. Now, there is political pushback at times, especially when adapting older horror to the modern landscape. When It Chapter 2 came out, it adapted a scene from the book where a gay couple is attacked in a homophobic hate crime. Now, in the book, at the time it was written, this scene was fairly progressive. It wasn't common for people to discuss gay people as legitimate people. They were treated more as the butt end of a joke. And the scene is fairly heartfelt, and it's 50 pages of the book. In the film, it's about a minute and a half of film time, and it felt more exploitative. Now, the film tried countering that by making Richie, one of the main characters of the movie, a queer man, a repressed queer man specifically. But that still didn't stop some critics from rightfully saying that while the scene worked in the 80s, this hate crime scene felt exploitative and, quite frankly, a little disturbing because it doesn't really progress or add to the plot of the film as it was trying to tell. And with so many alterations made to it in both It films, it felt odd that this was included still. Honestly, the films you see the most people criticize from the political standpoint are the centrist films, the films that try to appeal both sides of the party.
Did you see that article? Every year, these liberal elites kidnap a bunch of normal folks like us and hunt us for sport.
Take The Hunt, a film that ends with the message, you know, both sides of this political faction are pretty bad, actually.
I'm playing an Arab refugee, but I identify as white. I think that's problematic too.
Horror works better when there's a concrete fear it tries to manifest. Fence-sitting doesn't help anyone. There are publications that try to list scary movies or what have you. So conservative horror, and we should look at some of them right now. The Federalist, for example, ranked 8 of the best conservative horror films. And this is actually the one thing I am going to take from In Praise of Shadows, because he references this too. Let's see this list. Night of the Hunter, a film where a man is dressed like a priest who hunts women who own their sexuality. Wait, how's that conservative? That's like saying the authority figures are bad. The priest represents the old-time authority. It's maybe the opposite of conservative, I'd say, but what am I going to do? All right, what are you going to do? What else is there? There's Let the Right One In, which focuses on a couple social outsiders who form a relationship society would deem taboo. Hang on, that doesn't sound all that conservative either, unless you count the age gap. That might be conservative, who knows? In case you didn't get that joke, there is a law in many states that allow for child brides to still happen, and conservative political belief argues that rules were better back then, so they don't really repeal these old laws, where a lot of leftist politicians try to fight them. And these laws are very obviously still in the books in many red states, but even a few blue states haven't repealed these laws yet. We really should get around to doing that. I mean, seriously? What else is here? The Thing, a paranoid sci-fi film about a microscopic creature that can kill you. Well, after all the anti-information regarding COVID, I feel like that doesn't quite feel at home with the Conservative Party agenda. What else is there? Night of the Living Dead, the first mainstream horror film to feature a black actor in the lead that focuses on a new society devouring the old, while the dumb police at the end senselessly kill the lead character.
Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
The Federalist article is clickbait, quite frankly. And there's other films, too, that are ridiculous. You have Scanners on here, from famous director David Cronenberg, who argued that trans people embody the themes of his films very explicitly. Now, look, I am going to actually discuss real conservative films. And quite frankly, I'm going to name a few good ones. Better ones than the Federalist can, apparently, that illustrate the fears that conservatives do have. And they're not going to be obscure films either. They're going to be among the most well-known horror films to exist. In fact, a few of these are actually some of my all-time favorite horror films that are undeniably conservative. Let's get started.
Our continuing Beyond Belief series takes a look at mysterious religious practices around the world. Tonight, we take a look at exorcism.
Let's just cover an entire genre right now. Most religious horror is built on a foundation of conservative belief. The core tenet of this horror is that something from our religious ideologies will come to hurt us in our secular world. And the idea is that the modern day is moving too far from the church and too far from religion to notice these demons and monsters as they come at us. To further elaborate, the separation of church and state is a hot-button topic in politics.
Chief Justice Parker appeared on a video podcast hosted by a conservative, QAnon-believing, self-proclaimed prophet.
God created government. And the fact that we have let it go into the possession of others is heartbreaking for those of us who understand. And we know it is for him. And that's why he is calling and equipping people to step back into these mountains right now.
For many years now, it's been debated on how much influence religious belief should have on policy creation. The First Amendment protects people both from persecution based on their religion and freedom from other religions. So a hot-button topic is often how much influence should religious belief have in policy making?
Do you think that the Bible should be taught in public school?
I do.
What about separation of church and state?
I do.
But that's a state school, right? Teaching the Bible.
It is.
And this goes both ways, of course. When JFK was first elected as president, many people feared that because of his Catholic upbringing, he would be a puppet leader for the Pope himself. Now, in modern day politics, the big concern seems to be the impact that medicine and religion have upon each other. Will religious belief allow doctors to, say, deny care to certain patients should they choose to, or prescribe, let's say, unproven methods to fix a person's problem based purely on religious ideology? Is faith healing a substitution for actual medical process? I would argue, no, it's not. Maybe supplemental. Maybe you can go get some faith healing, but then see a doctor to diagnose your problems if that's what you're inclined to do. But again, this is a matter that is a hot-button topic in American politics for many, many years now. Now, this is built into the foundations of horror. The vampire, for example, is a folklore creature who was warded off by crosses. The Golem, one of the first horror films to ever be created, focuses on a Jewish monster. But modern-day religious horror is centered more and more on films like The Exorcist.
Something beyond comprehension is happening to a little girl on this street, in this house.
The original Exorcist is rooted in conservative beliefs, extremely so. William Peter Blatty was not quiet about his political beliefs either, so we can point to him and go, yeah, this is a conservative work. This is something I noticed while editing. I just want to point this out. While Blatty was a conservative man, William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist, was actually apolitical. He was very anti-politics. Maybe you can call him libertarian, but that's a stretch even. He was very much against inserting any politics in his movies, though, of course, while working with Blatty, it was impossible to not have some political ideas in his story.
My feeling was that was explaining to the audience how they should feel about this experience, telling them what this is about, which always seemed to me to be inherent in the story that you wrote. The meaning of that was inherent to me, and anything that stated it suddenly became like we were trying to teach the audience a lesson, which I think is the difference between your approach and mine. And I think if the film is successful, it's where your approach and mine both end and meet. You really believe that there is a specific meaning on these events, and that the audience must understand it to have a full experience. My feeling is there is a specific meaning to these events that the audience should discover for themselves.
I agree to an extent, Bill. I certainly believe that the film, as it is, delivers a positive message about faith and spirituality.
However, The Exorcist remains one of the all-time greatest horror films because it does something that a lot of storytellers with a political agenda think second. It tells a fantastic story. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The Exorcist is one of my all-time favorite horror films and horror novels. It's also a showcase for religious conservative ideology in a time that claimed the need for religion was dead. And it does this by focusing on two stories: a mother trying to figure out what's wrong with her daughter, and a priest losing his faith. In the case of Chris McNeil, her daughter Reagan, she's having some problems. She's having like these weird fits. She's saying some weird things. Her behavior's changing. She's taking her daughter to every single doctor, the thing that she's told she should do, and none of the experts can figure out.
You're sorry! Jesus Christ, 88 doctors, and all you can tell me with all of your bullshit is...
They do scans of her brain. Oh, there's no lesions here. Behaviorists talk to her. There's nothing they can tell. They hypnotize her. Nothing. Until finally...
Have you ever heard of exorcism? It has worked. The victim's belief in possession is what helped cause it. So in that same way, the belief in the power of exorcism can make it disappear.
Okay, she has this delusion that she's possessed. Let's bring a priest in to perform an exorcism. It's this old ritual. The church is embarrassed by it. It's outdated. It's the old ways. It's dumb. It's stupid. But it might be able to be a good shock therapy for your daughter. And so she seeks out an exorcist, which leads to the second part of the film, Father Karras. Father Karras is a priest who has kind of lost his faith. He's a therapist. He works on a college campus. His mother is extremely ill and old, and he has the old Italian Catholic guilt thing going, where he blames himself for everything that goes wrong with his mother. And his family kind of blames him too. And his mom kind of blames him too. Again, just like an Italian Catholic family. The thing is, the mother does pass away. And at his deepest level of grief, Chris McNeil comes and asks for him to perform an exorcism on her daughter. Neither of the two are in a position to believe the old ways are beneficial, but the old ways would ultimately saves Reagan's soul. The reason The Exorcist works so well while other stories fail is that it's a very human narrative, focused on actual human fears. God and worship barely factor into it. They do. I mean, it's all about priests and the church and all that, but it's the fear of a changing society. It's the fear of a mother not being able to take care of her daughter. It's the fear of a man who did something he felt was good, and that good path is leading him into failure and into misery. This isn't a film preaching ideas, it's a film projecting fear and putting the fear into human scenarios to make it more intimate to an audience. It should be noted that while Blatty himself was a conservative Catholic, religious reaction was a little more mixed, best summarized by this abstract from Amy C. Chambers: somewhere between science and superstition, religious outrage, horrific science, and The Exorcist. And I quote, "The Exorcist created a media frenzy in 1973, with increased reports in the popular press of demonic possession, audience members convulsing and vomiting at screenings, and apparent religious and specifically Catholic moral outrage. However, the official Catholic response to The Exorcist was not as reactionary as the press claimed. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office of Film and Broadcasting officially and publicly condemned the film as being unsuitable for a wide audience, but reviews produced for the office by priests and lay Catholics and correspondence between the Vatican and the USCCB show that the Church at least notionally interpreted it as a positive response to the power of faith, Warner Brothers Studio, however, were keen to promote stories of religious outrage to boost sales and news coverage, a marketing strategy that actively contradicted Friedkin's respectful and collaborative approach to working with both religious communities and medical professionals. Reports of Catholic outrage were a means of promoting The Exorcist rather than an accurate reflection of the Catholic Church's nuanced response to the film and its scientific and religious content. It should also be noted, however, that potentially spreading the word about exorcisms may have had a net negative for society, and we'll get to that later. Arguably the most successful modern religious horror film series is the Conjuring franchise, which turns the famous Warren family from a group of con artists into essentially superheroes of paranormal investigators. The only stand between us and the forces of hell itself. Again, some of the Conjuring series is excellent. It's a fun franchise horror series. It's also extremely conservative. The Warrens have this folksy Americana vibe to them. Ed and Lorraine Warren are so charming and lovely in these films. Again, completely at odds with their real-life counterparts, who, I repeat, were proving con artists. There's a true sense of love and family between them and their daughter and the people they help. They're straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. They also have the backing of the Catholic Church, who aren't covering up scandals about priests or any of that. What are you talking about? No, they're working tirelessly to protect us from the demons. They are cataloging all this information. They're like S.H.I.E.L.D. to the Avengers in this film series. And you know what? Again, it's done often very well. So we keep coming back to it. It's a showcase of monsters. We get to see these characters who we actually do care about confronting the forces of evil. And we get to see some villains who have become icons in the 2010s and still are icons to this day. Some modern religious horror has actually gone out of its way to deconstruct these institutions of power. A great example will be this year in 2024, where we got both Immaculate and the first Omen, both of which were films that criticized the church for their abusive power structures that strip people of their autonomy, often bodily autonomy. But these are few and far between. Some films almost break away from this conservative ideology, only to at the last second veer right back in. And a great example of this is The Last Exorcism, which starts off by showing someone who exposes exorcisms and possessions as fraudulent or delusional. The film focuses on one possession, which ultimately proves to be less a possession and more a traumatized girl experiencing this intense delusion. It's honestly a really great, really grounded exorcism movie that shows, it's not always possession. Until the end, where we veer right back into the supernatural and go, actually, demons were involved with everything. And there's a satanic cult. By the way, we'll get to satanic cults more in detail later. Just pin that in the back of the thing. And they're causing all the problems, and it's all real. Demons are real, and, the guy was wrong all of his life for trying to prove they were wrong. And it does the ultimate fence-sitting thing I can't fucking stand, where it goes, hey, here's a cool idea. We're going in this new direction. Oops, nope, we're going back to the tropes because that's what you like. That's what you're familiar with. And it completely undercuts just all the cool stuff it set up. Oh, I hate that. It's so annoying. It's such a pain in the ass. Again, this is what happens when I do it both ways. Do you want to criticize the modern day institutions of exorcisms, or do you want to just make an exorcism story from the old ways? Choose one. You can't do both. Unless you are the Exorcism of Emily Rose.
She said the Virgin Mary spoke to her in the middle of a field.
Yes.
And do you believe her?
I believe Emily spoke the truth.
Director Scott Derrickson is a man of faith, and his religious belief informs much of what he creates. Politically, it's unclear where Derrickson exactly falls. He has been criticized by the left for portraying the Ancient One in his Doctor Strange movie, who is a Tibetan man, the Ancient One, as a white woman. Now, that's kind of faded away as the movies have come out and all that, but that was a big point of criticism for a while. But he's also criticized Trump, comparing him to Hitler and Stalin. So clearly, he's not aligned with modern Republican belief. But he's also probably not super far on the left either. He's somewhere in that nebulous middle area, like most people are. I think it's because he's able to strike a balance with that The Exorcism of Emily Rose, an adaptation of the true story of Anneliese Mitchell, a young German woman who, in the mid-70s, was believed to have been possessed, he adapts that story quite well.
I had no interest in trying to persuade people to think my way. I wanted people to watch this film, be scared, be entertained, and at the end of the movie, to be provoked to think about these things more deeply, and in the end to decide for themselves what they believe.
Now, I am going to talk about the Annalise Mitchell case, and this is true. What I'm going to tell you is real. Annalise came from a conservative family. While in university, she started entering into bizarre fits and trances that led to both Annalise and her family to believe that she was possessed. This convinced the Catholic Church to intervene. During a staggering 67 exorcisms performed in about 7 months, Annalise stopped eating and drinking. She went from a fairly healthy weight to 67 pounds at the time of her death, and she did indeed die. Her bones were fractured, her body was just in an awful condition, malnourished, and it was horrible. The courts ruled that both Annalise's family and the Catholic Church were responsible for her death in a case of negligent homicide. They were trying to convince Annalise that she was possessed, and they were convinced that she was possessed, but in doing so, allowed her to die. You might be thinking, well, what if Annalise was possessed? I've heard the audio, and I'm going to play some right now. She sounds possessed.
Im Namen deines Sohnes, den Jungfrau, im Namen Jesu, befehle ich dir auszufahren.
But I left out a key detail, very deliberately. Annalise had epilepsy. All of Annalise's hallucinations, seizures, delusions, behaviors could be traced to epilepsy, especially if the medicine she was taking was no longer having an effect, as was the case with a lot of these older medicines. They kind of wore off after a while, or your body became immune to them in some way. And again, modern medicine would be able to detect this and fix this right away, but it's the 70s. Don't really have that. And all of this happened very quickly, so people weren't even able to diagnose her. Except they were, and the family ignored the diagnoses. Again, the family was from an extremely conservative part of Germany, like extremely conservative. They thought that Vatican II was a bad idea, which changed the masses from being in Latin to English. So they were really conservative. And so when they saw a sign of God, they acted. They insisted that they could see their daughter manifest stigmata. They could smell sulfur around her. They all claimed they saw the Virgin Mary or felt the Virgin Mary's presence come to Annalise. But that's all probably part of a shared delusion that they had. They were so convinced of what they saw that any sign around them felt like confirmation. That's my belief, and that's what the court's belief was. Now, the church, it's hard to say what the church believes. I do know that the church made it much harder to perform exorcisms to avoid a situation like this again, which was both a tragedy and a horrible controversy for the church. But Annalise Mitchell's family, until their dying day, firmly believed Annalise was possessed. Regardless of what the court said, regardless of what medical people said, they believed it so firmly they brought it with them to the grave. And they believed that their actions saved their daughter's immortal soul. I clearly do not believe this, but I also wouldn't have made The Exorcism of Emily Rose with the sort of humanity that Derrickson does if I made it. And it's a good thing I didn't make it, because quite frankly, I'm not the right person to make that story. But Derrickson was. He was the perfect filmmaker for this because he balances the spectacle of the exorcism and what could have been with the medical reality of Emily's condition. And the film shows the court make its decision that also chooses not to confirm or deny through the text or narrative whether or not Emily was possessed. But they do confirm that Emily and her family believed Emily was possessed.
You will suffer greatly, but through you, many will come to see that the realm of the spirit is real.
It's all told through the framing device of the court's drama. So we're told one side. And yes, while that side's more spectacular, more visually interesting, the court does offer its contradictory idea, and it's pretty compelling. That being said, it's not a choice that's without criticism. Look, I'm just going to rephrase what I said right here, because while editing, I realized that I don't know what the fuck I was talking about here. The film and many other exorcism movies helped create a resurgence of hoaxes, of fake exorcists who would provide themselves as a remedy for any problem.
You say you've done 40,000 exorcisms?
Over a career of 40 years, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, your kid is having a weird fever? He might have a demon inside of him. Oh, your child is having autism? That means demons will come over and will just perform 75 Hail Marys over him, and that'll just solve his autism for you.
What seminary did you go through?
Well, I did online study and by correspondence, and was able to complete it that way because I don't have the ability to just sit one place at one time.
Yeah.
And you laugh, but a lot of people who are desperate and who may not be educated on the sciences of a certain situation and may have a religious belief system might be inclined to fall for these snake oil salesmen who are providing a miracle cure for their child's problem or a relative's problem. This is something that's been done for years, but the Exorcism of Emily Rose helped lend credence to the idea that these snake oil salesmen were correct. And I want to point out again that after the Annalise Mitchell case, the Catholic Church demanded a lot more before they'd send an exorcism anywhere. And there's a lot of standards for the Catholic Church now for the exorcisms. The possessed have to demonstrate knowledge that they should have no way of knowing. They have to have a supernatural event occur around them. And there's like a point system. It's very tough to qualify for a Jesuit exorcist ritual. Most of these hucksters, they just kind of show up, they say, oh, we can perform an exorcism for you, and they charge through the teeth. They charge a ridiculous amount of money for ultimately just waving their hands and quoting a movie that everyone's seen to lend credence to the idea that this is something they can do that will solve your problems.
On your website, you say that it's $495 for an in-person encounter.
That's correct.
$395 for a Skype.
Correct.
And $295 for phone.
Correct.
So you can do an exorcism on the phone?
Obviously, Scott Derrickson and William Blatty didn't do this. They didn't give credence to this idea. They're just telling a story. And they shouldn't be held accountable for these fraudsters' actions. But, unfortunately, the very real reality is oftentimes our actions have unintentional consequences. I'm not saying we should blame these people for this at all, by no means. But I am saying that the film's success kind of did result in this very real trend that caused many people very real harm. Okay, back to your video. It results in bodily harm. It results in people neglecting their meds, not getting treated for conditions they can easily be treated for. And it's very upsetting because these films do encourage people because it influences how you interpret the world. And they go, hey, you don't have epilepsy, or you have a demon inside you. Don't get treatment. Go to an exorcist. And the exorcist is usually a fraudulent guy because the Catholic Church isn't going to perform an exorcism again after the last time. They're going to need signs. You need to speak another language that you don't know. You need to have some supernatural event. Can't manifest that. Well, they're not going to do anything for you. And it's created this kind of microscopic market for hucksters to take advantage of people, and that sucks. That actually really upsets me because people get hurt. People are injured from this. People are sick who need help, who aren't given the treatment they need because people are trying to throw their snake oil holy water at them. It's terrible.
Jessica has gone beyond the door. At first, she didn't believe, but she does now.
And there's other films too that came out after all these films. So just god awful. There's a demonic possession film every couple of months, and most of them are garbage, and they mostly relate the same ideas. The church is right. God and devils are real. If something happens to you, it's going to be in a grandiose fashion, and there's very little humanity in the stories. Both The Exorcist and The Exorcism of Emily Rose focus on humanity and human fears first and foremost. Something like The Devil Inside is just a cheap cash in trying to give you the iconography of that without any of the actual ideas. Now, it is worth noting that a lot of these exorcism films do not incorporate bigotry or anything like that into their filmmaking. Most recently, Exorcist the Believer, the most recent exorcism film at the time of this recording, tried to showcase that all worlds have exorcist tropes and cultures, and that if we all ganged up together, we can stop demons together. Trying to show that humanity of assembly and coming together, but unfortunately, not all political filmmaking is quite so accepting of all demographics. And a lot of that has to do with the fear that the other is coming to get you. Let's start with the most easy to discuss.
That's the focus tonight of Lonnie Lardner's special report on Satanism. But we want to warn you now that some things you're about to see and hear might be too graphic for children.
The Satanic Panic was a conservative movement that started in the mid to late 70s and extended, well, actually it's kind of still going on, but it goes through waves of relevance and often changes its messaging to be more acceptable in the times.
As shocking as this may sound, science has revealed that there is a demonic aspect to narcissism.
Basically, the fear is that there is a massive group of Satanists that are right now in society planning to destroy the world and corrupt the youth using rock music and Dungeons and Dragons, Pokemon, Harry Potter, Disney films, you name it. I think now they're grappling onto narcissists as a big point of contention. I know there was a Sarah Z video about that recently that was interesting. Adding validity to this paranoid conspiracy theory is that there were many real people who, under hypnosis, recounted stories about being abused by cults, of witnessing anywhere from a few babies being sacrificed to several thousand babies being sacrificed to the devil. It should be noted that the police never found any bodies or physical evidence of this happening, and there's still no proof that any of this happened. And in fact, some people who, under hypnosis, made these claims later admitted they just lied, which is certainly something worth discussing. But again, that didn't change the fact that people believe this authentically.
And listen to these titles. Listen how many of them have something to do with Satanism or the occult. Sympathy for the Devil, Dancing with Mr. D by the Rolling Stones. Devil's Den and Dance with the Dragon by Jefferson Starship. Evil Ways and Soul Sacrifice by Santana. And listen to these by the rock group AC/DC. Rock and Roll Damnation, Let There Be Rock, Highway to Hell, and this is my favorite right here. Hell ain't a bad place to be.
Anyone that they thought was satanic became a Satan worshiper. And people started looking. They started looking in society for any person who was maybe wore dark clothing one day, or who liked Iron Maiden a little too much, or who was really into playing Dungeons and Dragons with his friends or her friends. That Satanist. The Satanic Panic had real consequences for people who did die. Their deaths were put into this big mythology of satanic evil, and this ultimately culminated in 1994, where Damien Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin were sentenced to life in prison, save for Damien, who was put on death row for the murder of 3 young boys. Investigators believe the boys were murdered as part of a satanic ritual, despite there being no evidence to suggest that was the case, nor was there any evidence to suggest that any of the 3 teens, dubbed the West Memphis 3, had any involvement in the crime. There was no physical evidence, they weren't on the scene, they weren't even in the same location, there was no motivation, there was no cause, nothing. Not a fraction of evidence.
There was no evidence, absolutely no evidence linking them to the crime. These kids didn't drive. The 3 bodies, bizarrely, had no blood around them. So clearly they were taken from the murder scene to this drainage ditch. Damien lived 8 miles away from where the bodies were buried. Never drove. None of these kids drove. They didn't have cars. It was an incredible miscarriage of justice.
But because these 3 boys wore dark clothing a lot and were a little spooky, the town police just thought, yep, Satan, and they're responsible. Now, what happened was the boys were arrested after Miskelly, who was, I should mention, both a minor at the time and had some developmental disabilities. He was interrogated for 12 hours with only 42 minutes being recorded for us to listen to now, where police basically forced a confession out of him. Now, Miskelly later claimed that the police threatened him and those he cared about if he didn't fess up, among other coercive tactics used. Later, third-party investigation revealed to the police that they had tampered with their own evidence, not out of malice, but out of pure incompetency. But no matter what, the police refused to relent, and the court sided with the police. In 2007, DNA was collected from the bodies of the boys that proved none of the West Memphis 3 could have possibly been the killer. It wasn't until 2011 that the West Memphis Three were finally released on a plea deal. But despite all the counter evidence, many of the investigators and the members of the court still believe the West Memphis Three did it, despite there being no evidence they committed the crime, and they believe they did it as some part of satanic ritual, despite there being no evidence that the murders were a satanic ritual. It's the most infuriating thing in the world. But with that knowledge, you can understand why so many stories about satanic cults ring hollow to me. There are two kinds of satanic panic films. There's the kind where the cult is pretty obvious with all their evil culty stuff. The Devil Rides Out, The Blood on Satan's Claw, The House of the Devil, Lords of Salem, among others. And in that, they usually use satanic imagery more like a heavy metal album cover uses satanic imagery, as this kind of metal crazy thing, or as a source of pure fear. But then there are films like Rosemary's Baby or The Omen that show Satan worshippers as these chameleons. They slink into society and they blend in positions of power to subvert these systems of power to better benefit themselves. I think The Omen is especially fascinating in this regard, given that its prequel, the first Omen, completely recontextualizes how the cult works. In the original film, the cult is a purely satanic institution that murders a baby of a senator and replaces him with the spawn of Satan, and they plan on infiltrating the world of politics and economy to introduce new technologies that change the structure of world power. Damien becomes a manufactured billionaire who uses his power and influence to become a tyrant behind the scenes, orchestrating war for his personal benefit. Damien and his satanic army are outsiders who destroy a good institution, changing it into a global agenda of destruction. But in the first Omen, that's not the case. We find out that the satanic cult that's been supporting Damien isn't a satanic cult. They're Catholics who plan on using Damien to put the fear of God back into the world, to bring back a religious order where the church stands as the ultimate authorities. And to do this, they're forcibly trafficking and breeding people with demonic jackal monsters to create the Antichrist. The institutions aren't being invaded. They're resetting themselves to a time where they had more power and authority. It turns the conservative Omen into a liberal, leftist perspective. But the thing is, both movies are fantastic. They're both excellently told, excellently acted, excellently paced. There is gravitas to every scene. And while the first Omen does have some sequences that are deeply disturbing, the original is still more memorable. They're both really good films. Same with Rosemary's Baby, though there's some context to that one.
Paramount Pictures presents Mia Farrow in a William Castle production, Rosemary's Baby.
It's a film that shows an old generation of witches manipulate a young couple into creating the Antichrist. This old order takes control of Rosemary's pregnancy after essentially offering her up to the devil himself. They control how she eats, they control how she talks, who she talks to, the information she receives, all in order to get what they want. She is stripped of bodily autonomy. However, the only thing is, what they want is a new world order. Not returning to the old ways, but rather a new order where the old god is dead. They represent the undercurrent who chooses to destroy the status quo, but it's communicated through the personal fears of bodily autonomy and paranoia. It's a conservative societal fear interlocked with leftist personal fear. And much like everything else Roman Polanski has ever touched, it leaves you feeling sick and disturbed by the end of it. It's also easy to watch a movie where the villains are Satanists, because unlike real-life Satanists, who are basically just atheists with extra steps, it's hard to sympathize with people who worship evil.
Contrary to popular belief of Satanists being animal killers, we believe that animals and small children are the highest form of magic, and therefore it would be completely sacrilegious to harm these beings.
A lot of movies remix the satanic panic imagery, as I was mentioning before, in order to basically create like a heavy metal album, like Deathgasm or Trick or Treat, which is not to be confused with Trick or Treat. It's important not to mix up satanic panic with folk horror, by the way, which often focuses on things older than Christendom lurking to upheave society, such as the case in the 1970s Wicker Man movie, where an extremely Catholic man, or Christian man, I forget exactly if it's Catholic or Christian, is, he's a police investigator, goes to an island with a neo-pagan cult who worships nature and old gods, and his religious beliefs are put to the test against them. At the end of the film, neither God is shown to be real, but we do explicitly see that the Christian God sure doesn't seem interested in saving his faithful from horror. Now, what I want to bring up right now is so far we focused mainly on religious-themed horror. But what about horror that has no religion in it whatsoever? Does it exist? Well, yeah.
There are only two horror stories that you can tell. We're all sitting around a campfire in the old days, and a medicine man is standing there. And we're a tribe, and he says, "Let me tell you where the evil is. It's out there beyond the darkness. It's the other tribe. It's the beasts in the woods." That's the evil. Same situation. We're in a circle around a campfire. The medicine man, the holy man, stands up and says, "I'll tell you where evil is. It's right in here. It's in our human hearts. It's in us."
Horror focused on outsiders coming in is inherently conservative. The way of life for our heroes is destroyed by some stranger coming in to ruin things. The status quo is broken up, and often restoring the status quo will save everything. Just about every 1950s B-movie about aliens coming to Earth features the ultimate outsiders coming into, they're crossing our cosmic border, they're bringing crime and corruption here and attacking the cities, eating the dogs in some cases. And it's only thanks to the United States military and the good old charming Norman Rockwell citizens of the world that we're able to repel them back. These illegal aliens coming in to take our jobs in our world. A little conservative, I'd say. If it's not that, it's about that newfangled science, and those scientists going too far with their machines, making the insects gigantic and eating us and all that. And it's only thanks to Clint Eastwood. Surprisingly, Clint Eastwood shows up a lot in these movies to stop these guys, or, whoever the cowboy western actor is in this movie. When monster movies reigned, it could be argued that the monsters represented some political idea. Arguably. I mean, let's be honest. At the end of the day, you watch Tarantula not because Tarantula represents the fears of modern medicine or science, but because it's a giant tarantula that kills people. That's fun. You watch these movies for, it's all allegorical. Unless it's that Gila Monster movie where they talk about, in the trailer, a big black terror. That could be something else. I'm not sure about that.
What is this black menace that kills everything it sees and hears?
But eventually, the monsters were switched out with people. The monsters could be allegorical, could be. You can make the argument. But when you switched from monsters to people, things got a little harder to discuss. Because quite frankly, it's easier to discuss a person representing a political idea than a giant monster. A lot of people began to point to slashers as being bastions of conservative ideology. I mean, if you do drugs, you get killed off. If you make love, you are killed off. Underage drinking, that's a death sentence. Only the pure final girl survives. Right? Well, not really. A lot of slasher films are exploitative, and they show audiences what they want to see. But they don't want to really show the consequences of that as much. There's slashers like Black Christmas that do discuss sexual autonomy in a way that's really interesting and dynamic. But most films, they want to show the teens what they want, and then they want to kill the characters off so you don't have to worry about the consequences after the fact. No unplanned pregnancies or anything like that. So they take the easy route. Instead of discussing the repercussions of sex and all that, they just kill the characters off. Because it's in a fun way, in a spectacular fashion. And while films like Scream did definitely play with these tropes and ultimately dismantle them, Scream will come back later, by the way. Even earlier films like Child's Play, Nightmare on Elm Street, and even Friday the 13th, the original one, subvert and play with these ideas. Now, I'm not really interested in making broad statements about slasher tropes, like, a subgenre with so many of its own tropes that got reinvented every few years. If I say something sweeping about slashers as a 40-year genre, it's not going to apply to everything. However, Because unlike Exorcism movies, they actually do change from every couple of years. Rather, what I do want to focus on are a few specific cases of certain ideas, specifically The Outsider. A lot of slasher films do showcase a deformed villain. Case in point, The Burning, which focuses on a guy named Cropsey, who is burned in his cabin by his campers. He's horribly burned. He comes back years later and goes on a mass rampage, only to bump into, not intentionally but accidentally, one of the campers who initially burned him. Jason Voorhees, he is a child with clear developmental issues and physical deformities who is allowed to drown in a lake because the camp counselors don't care enough to watch after him. Their appearances are reserved as this shocking jump scare, essentially. They build up to it. Their position of horror, their physicality. But, you know, it's tough to argue that's really meant to reflect any real person, because none of these people look like real people. Their physical differences, however, set them apart from the traditionally beautiful campers. But this doesn't always come across as demeaning. Freddy Krueger, for example, is a monstrous predator who was burned by the parents of his victims. He's also a spirit. He can choose to look like anything, and he chooses to look burned. He decides to embrace his appearance to terrify people. He owns this, which further elevates him as a deliberate outsider. He even wears the fedora, which kind of looks like a cowboy hat that you'd see in the old westerns when the bad guy would stroll into town. Little dark hat guy, you know, it's cool. It's good. Freddy Krueger has style, and he owns it. Conversely, someone like Angela from Sleepaway Camp is presented as... let me get to Angela.
Welcome to Sleepaway Camp. Someone is watching you.
So, Angela is complicated, especially in terms of her gender identity. Spoilers for Sleepaway Camp. Angela is assigned male at birth, gets into an accident. Angela's aunt forces Angela to become a girl. So, it's kind of like forced gender reassignment in a way. Some trans people have seen this and think it's horrible and think that's really, really outdated of an idea. It communicates ideas that adults are grooming people into being trans, and that's not cool. On the other hand, some trans people watch that and go, that's a good representation of how dysphoria feels. Feeling like you're in the wrong body. And they really like that. And again, I'm not trans, so I can't speak to either experience. I just wanted to put those two ideas out there because I want to really discuss Angela as the outsider. What's interesting about Sleepaway Camp 2, from my perspective, is that the majority of on-screen kills that Angela commits, again, the majority, there's a few that don't fit this, most of the characters who are developed who she slashes are bad people. There's the one cook who's a complete predator. There's the one bully who's just relentlessly mean to Angela. And these are the people that Angela targets. And you're kind of like, you know what? They're kind of awful. Granted, not everyone. There's a scene where she kills a bunch of kids. That's really weird and exploitative and feels out of character for Angela. It comes out of nowhere. It feels this one wanted to put more bodies in the film, or be shocking or something like that. But a lot of the people that Angela kills, they're not people that you're all that esteemed to. I feel like Sleepaway Camp is a better example of a more mixed reception. Because I think it's interesting. I think discussion with film is interesting. I think that if we have different opinions, different perspectives, that's kind of cool, and I like that. And Sleepaway Camp represents that idea perfectly. You can see either side of it, just be respectful. What's not up for debate, however, is that there are some less subtle interpretations of gender identity and sexuality that have been used as shorthand to villainize LGBTQIA people. Now, I've discussed queer coding in villains extensively in other videos, but to make a long story short, a lot of queer creators couldn't incorporate overtly queer content into film, and so they slipped it in wherever possible. And usually, the only ones they were allowed to make a little queer were the antagonists. So, no, the Rocky Horror Picture Show is not a conservative message or a trans minstrel show, as certain people have said, because Dr. Frankenfurter is whatever Dr. Frankfurter is. So yeah, some things haven't aged as well, but just because they haven't aged perfectly well does not mean that they were horrible, Lily. But again, some films, like Dressed to Kill, are about just trans people being evil and scary because they're trans. Dressed to Kill exploits that imagery constantly, that the horror comes from the killer being dressed like a woman. Other films, like Psycho and Silence of the Lambs, seem aware that the audiences will think that the villains who dress up as women and want to become women might be confused with actual trans people, and include lines of dialogue in the film to differentiate themselves from the real-world implications.
There's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. Transsexuals are very passive.
Have a go.
You can make the argument whether or not it's a successful enough separation, but they do try. Mind you, all these films I've just described are great horror films. They're great thrillers. But these elements are impossible to ignore from a modern standpoint, especially when trans people, who themselves are often the victims of crimes, are being accused of being potential criminals in political spaces. Now, De Palma's directing style and writing style in Dressed to Kill is undeniably fantastic. They are great scenes and great thrills, but unlike a lot of queer-coded villains, and even unlike Psycho, it's the fact that they are not cis that is seen as a point of fear in the audience. That's the fear. It's impossible to separate Dressed to Kill from the very real implications that Dressed to Kill has, and the real-life implications of fearing that trans people are capable of some evil crime spree. It's just not true. There's no evidence for it. In keeping with the focus of this video, however, I do want to point out a few examples where the inverse happens, where conformity to the quote-unquote norm is seen as the fear, and the outsiders are the protagonists. A great example of this would be Society, the 90s film that implies that the rich aren't simply in charge of everything, but are actively devouring and assimilating the poor. We've already mentioned The Stepford Wives early on, as well as Night of the Living Dead, but there are many cases where horror showcases the efforts of a few outsiders working beyond what is expected of them in order to break through society's conditioning and levels of control. The outsider is naturally a very easy person to sympathize with. Even when the film is trying to show the outsider as some sort of antagonist, a lot of the time, audiences will sympathize with these outside antagonists anyway. The greatest example of this is the Frankenstein monster. In the original Universal films, he is presented as a monster, but his humanism, his sense of vulnerability and innocence, drew audiences to sympathize with the monster. It's therefore very strange when a story presents someone as the outsider and demonizes traits that make them an outsider. Which I think leads me to the point I'm really building on. In the last 20 years, there is one piece of media that embodies every conservative horror trope in the worst possible way. The thing that's so strange, however, is that this conservative story is criticized by conservatives for being woke, for being politically left. But it's in actuality a Trojan horse, extremely right-wing belief presented through the lens of a leftist story. And I think that's very despicable, and I think it's very awful, and I'm talking, of course, about Velma.
I thought lesbians were good at solving crimes. It's like the one positive stereotype perpetuated by cop shows.
Velma is a 2-season, and thankfully only 2-season, animated series that was blessedly canceled recently. It is widely regarded as one of the worst modern works of animation. Many people argue it's an example of the woke mind virus, trying to rebalance the scales in society with its colorblind casting. And I'm saying, no, it's a racist, sexist, body fat-phobic nonsense of a story that is meant to make you want to harken back to the way things were. It's meant to make you want to go back to the way things are because the new stuff is bad. It's meant to illustrate that progress is not good and that anyone who falls outside of society's standards is ugly and awful and worthy of repulsion. Let me break down why. Velma owes every single bone in its body to two people, Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson, because Velma just was better when it was called Scream.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Oh, come on, you know I don't watch that shit.
Why not? Too scared? Hello, Velma. Do you like solving mysteries?
Yeah, but I'm actually much more three-dimensional than that.
Scream is a deconstruction of slasher tropes, many of which Wes Craven helped create in Nightmare on Elm Street. Craven and Williamson were both very progressive filmmakers. Craven had made some of the most effective anti-violence films of the 70s with, again, Last House on the Left and Hills Have Eyes. He deconstructed the American dream in The Hills Have Eyes and directly criticized racist people directly with films like The People Under the Stairs. Kevin Williamson himself, a gay man, lifted from that in his own work. The result, one of the best horror comedies of all time that pokes fun at the past while still pushing forward. Also, Scream, queer-coded villains. See, you can have queer coding without it being homophobic. Seriously, watch how the two ghost faces, how they're interacting with each other, how they are holding each other, how they talk to each other, how they want to really sheath their knives in one another. You get the idea. Anyway, what did Scream do that Velma ripped off? Well, for one, that kind of self-reflective, deconstructive humor, poking fun of itself in the past, saying the past was bad and lame. Problem is, Scream did that lovingly. Velma does it with vicious mockery.
I think it has something to do with drugs, which I hate. This guy stinks!
Even Scooby-Doo had taken from Scream in previous iterations. The James Gunn films from the 2000s, Mystery Incorporated from the later aughts, even the 4 direct-to-video Scooby-Doo films in the late 90s, early 2000s, all used a kind of Scream-esque meta-humor to further reinforce the narrative. And like Scream, did it lovingly, poking fun at the past while also moving forward in a new direction. Velma does not do that.
My guilt triggers a potentially heart-stopping hallucination. Could exercising and eating less fried food help? We'll never know.
There are 2 problems with Velma, despite it being a Scooby-Doo show. It's clear that Mindy Kaling and the series creator, whom I will name later, just retrofitted another idea into Scooby-Doo, and is constantly wrestling with the expectations of the source material. Now, none of the characters feel right, and the humor owes more to Family Guy than anything else. Again, saying that things were better in the past because Family Guy started 20 years ago when the show came out.
If there is one thing the internet agrees on, it's that you should never change anything ever. I hope you die. Sincerely, Velma.
But arguably worse than all that, this series masquerades as progressive, but it's actually quite regressive. Mindy Kaling's Velma is a South Indian, overweight, bisexual protagonist. And there is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with this decision. For a character like Velma, who has been appearing in stories for decades and countless years, and is going to keep continuing in the future, changing her for one adaptation, that's not a big deal. Nor is the idea of changing all the characters' ethnicities. But there's one problem. They don't just change the characters' ethnicities, they change them into stereotypes. And the fact that they're different ethnicities is the butt of the joke.
I can't get banned for your thoughts on South Asian desserts again.
I know, it's okay. Like the dessert course at an Indian restaurant. Just forget it.
Now think about Mindy Kaling, the actress who forced herself onto gay actor Lee Pace and threatened her staff with termination if they told anyone, is that Mindy has made a career mocking other South Asian people, demonizing their appearances into something other. Mindy produced Velma in several earlier projects, meaning she has a lot more control over them than, say, the average writer or director. And all of her projects incorporate a degree of racism directed towards people of color, despite her being a woman of color. Oh, and her brother lied about being black in order to get into med school and wrote a book about it. That's something that happened that I felt like I should mention as well. Now, one question you probably have is, why am I mentioning Scooby-Doo in a video about horror movies? Well, quite frankly, Scooby-Doo has always been adjacent to horror. Ignoring the fact that it crossed over with something like Supernatural, Scooby-Doo always was a pastiche of gothic horror tropes and the mystery investigations therein. It's meant to make something scary feel accessible, and I firmly believe that Scooby-Doo serves as a gateway drug to many prospective horror fans growing up. Mindy used her clout in Hollywood to tear apart something people genuinely loved, and made Velma, which is a show that is extremely sex negative, extremely fatphobic, extremely queerphobic, mocks the disabled, and ultimately serves to eventually reestablish the status quo it dissects. Velma, in this show, is this annoying know-it-all, condescending to everyone around her, but she's ultimately proven wrong about everything. There are several episodes where Velma is shown that she could really stop being so judgmental of everyone, and it would benefit the world, but she just chooses not to. She ignores any progress that she's supposed to make. She refuses to change, and fails to actually fix the world. She accuses white men of being the problem when she's wrong, which illustrates that these people who are critical of white men are inherently frantic or fanatical. That's the messaging of the show. Because Velma's wrong almost constantly. She rarely actually does solve any mystery. Most of the answers are revealed to her. And the answers that are revealed are nonsensical. Just think about the villain of season 1 with Velma, with Fred's mom. Try to think of that for a few seconds if you've seen the show. And you realize that the logic falls apart completely the moment you put any thought into it. To elaborate further, what this effectively does is it turns Velma into a leftist straw man, a stereotype that is proven to be wrong demonstrably throughout the show. What this does is it illustrates these viewpoints and people like this are inherently wrong. That is the statement the show makes. Obviously, this is a massive oversimplification of the actual points that many leftists have, especially when criticizing white power structures. But by reducing it to this argument, it makes it easier to just kind of point and go, haha, look how dumb this argument is, and move on. That is not something a leftist show would do, and I find it very strange when people point out Velma as something that is trying to be woke or quote-unquote progressive. I find it strange when you have to kind of square away these two ideas. The idea that makes leftists look ridiculous and that somehow it's inherently leftist. I just question that argument entirely. It's meant to look like something that's leftist, but in actuality it is as far from it as possible. Further, it also mocks mental health issues. While Velma has these hallucinations that are the result of hypnosis, whenever someone else has a mental problem, it's mockery. Velma mocks Daphne's insecurities publicly. There is a lot of scenes where therapists are mocked. Again, it's pointing to people who are different and going, ha ha, you're the other, you're bad, you're not good enough. And ultimately, Velma is proven ultimately wrong. The whole show, she's talking about how ghosts aren't real and there's no supernatural explanations for anything. Only for at the end, the final solution of the series is solved because Velma is killed, becomes a ghost, and possesses the big bad, who is Scrappy-Doo. It illustrates that everything Velma has represented is inherently wrong. And ultimately what this does is it shows that the old ways were better, that this progressive new approach is wrong, that the old world was smarter, better, and that if you fall outside of this certain ideal, you are wrong.
Yes, that's a classic, and that's my point. Why change anything when the classics all still work, right?
Despite featuring a diverse cast, the diversity exists only to poke fun at the idea of diversity. There's a lot of internalized racism Kaling appears to be projecting onto her characters, not to mention all the body shaming. All of this instills that by the show's logic, being white and thin is preferable to being heavier and South Asian, which is racist and fatphobic. And look, I'm just beating a dead horse at this point. Everyone knows this show sucks. There's 1,000 videos about it. But what my point is that it falls into all of the discussions of conservative media failing to communicate ideas properly. It's extremely regressive, and it's exhausting seeing people act the show is leftist in some way. It's not. It's a Trojan horse at best. It's every single conservative discussion, and in fact falls into the worst traits that smartly written conservative media have avoided. In all the previous stories that we've discussed in this video so far, Velma embodies what you probably expected when you read this title. Yet, better filmmakers avoided them consistently. And there's nothing wrong with Velma being South Asian, queer, fat, none of that inherently. The problem is how it's framed in the narrative, because characterization is so important. Oh, by the way, I left out a key detail. Mindy Kaling is not the creator of Velma. She isn't even the writer. She isn't even the director. She's the executive producer and the voice actor. But the real creator is Charlie Grandy. And Charlie Grandy is the son of Fred Grandy. Some of you guys might remember him as Grandy from The Love Boat, if you're like 70. Or watched TV Land a lot when you were sick at home. However, others might know him as the Iowa U.S. House Representative from 1987 to 1995. And Grandy was a member of the Republican Party, in case you didn't know. Afterwards, Fred Grandy worked on the Grandy and Andy Morning Show, a DC talk radio show with a strong Republican perspective.
Veganism is a regimen, not a religion. It is a choice, like rooting for the Redskins or deciding to be gay.
Now, am I saying Charlie Grandy shares his father's political beliefs? Well, no, because a kid may not have the same beliefs as his father. But I am saying that he's produced nothing that's proven otherwise. It's also odd how Velma has been marketed as a Mindy Kaling work when it was really made again by a white guy. And no one's blaming Charlie for Velma. They blame Mindy Kaling because she's front and center. What I'm saying is this. Velma is a conservative horror only because we're dealing with it in real life.
Velma, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
So help me, Shonda Rhimes, I do.
All right. Different outfit. This means I threw out the old conclusion and we filmed a new one because I didn't like how it was turning out. That tends to happen around here. I guess let's just cut right to the chase. At the end of the day, what are we supposed to make of all of this? That some conservative horror stories are good and others are bad? That Velma was made to give grifters a semi-legitimate thing to point at and go, oh, that's bad, that's the bad thing. Well, that seems like an odd conclusion, right? Especially given that we're talking about horror stories up until this point. Well, there's a reason for this. There's a method behind my madness. Originally, my video was going to end with me just ranting about Velma some more, but that's not interesting to me. That didn't hit hard enough. Ultimately, a lot of what this video serves is to differentiate 2 points. How conservative belief is far more multifaceted than folks online will often like you to believe, and how some works can promote conservative ideas even unintentionally, or perhaps regardless of intention. I'll be honest, I don't really know if Velma is some Trojan horse for the right, but I do know the show is pervasive with conservative rhetoric and conservative anxieties, and that bleeds through the narrative. It's a self-contradictory series. Is that because the creators are secret conservatives, or because maybe the show is just bad? I can't prove either way. We're living in an era right now where making a story political is a red flag, so to speak. But it's not always intentional how those politics get in the narrative. I just recently rewatched Return of the Living Dead, right? It's a film that's extremely political. It takes place during the Cold War. There's anti-government rhetoric in it. There is a lot of elements of the small business being affected by government negligence, and government negligence resulting in disasters for people who are just caught in the middle. The movie focuses a lot on punk culture, punk being, of course, anti-authoritarian, and these punks are negatively impacted by the man, very directly, for being incompetent. That's a political message, but someone can watch that and it can go completely over their head, especially as we move further and further away from the 1980s, where this film was created, and thus the message was most profoundly impactful. That entire film, Return of the Living Dead, is a response to the Reagan-era big government, corporation, no regulations nonsense. It's an extremely politically savvy film, yet nowadays, unless that film aligns with your particular belief system, you might not even pick up on the politics. And in fact, today, if a film is released and it has any political thought, you're going to get 1,000 videos online complaining about it. And this has always been the case. Before it was called woke, it was called politically correct or social justice warrior. It's a new word for the same general grievance every single time. Horror usually feels exempt from this discourse because horror is often focused on manifesting fear, taking the fears that we feel inside and making the story around it. And because politics are a reflection of our worldview, and horror is a reflection of our worldview, there is often some commonality between political fears and horror movie fears. The difference is, usually horror movies are a little more abstract about it, and thus, we're not really receptive to the specific red party, blue party nonsense that we see if we discuss these fears publicly, and with the first words that come to mind. We use imagery in horror, not language. Not always, anyway. But that's the thing. We now say things are problematic. We say things are woke. We use these words as a catch-all for anything that we don't align with, personally. Now, I promised I wouldn't discuss the In Praise of Shadows video too much, but what bothered me about that video was it threw out a lot of all-encompassing language, very willy-nilly, and it didn't really always go into specifics. Like, yeah, it mentioned Jason Blum and him being conservative, which I believe he is conservative, but by criticizing Jason Blum, you're also criticizing all the journalists who watch movies made by Jason Blum? Like, it's one of those things where like we're way too all-encompassing with our criticism. If there is a single thing we can chip away at, that means the whole of it is bad, and we gotta get rid of it. That's the mentality I'm trying to fight against. I don't think that's the case. I think these things are deeply rooted in society, and in order to discuss them, we have to be frank. We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to go, hey, these are things that exist in the world, and we should acknowledge them and discuss how they impact every facet of our lives. In fact, the last point about Velma, I criticized Charlie Grandy, right? Guy you probably don't like. You don't like Velma, most likely. Most people don't. So you were probably on my side for most of the arguing. Me saying, yeah, he's a secret conservative. And you're like, yeah, he is a secret conservative. But there's a catch. I kind of did something that In Praise of Shadows also did. And I didn't realize it until reviewing the footage and cutting it down. My argument suggested intention. It did not prove motivation. I suggested he could be a secret conservative, but did I really prove it? Did I actually cement that down and say, no, here's his evidence, here's the document saying it? I didn't pull away with Scott Derrickson and William Peter Blatty, who outright have said their political beliefs. No, I'm just extrapolating something based on the messages of the media they created and running with the message. That's not too different from what he did in his video. Except the difference there is that he did to people that people actually liked. You see what I mean? The critical analysis was equally flawed on my part as well as his. Difference is, you don't like Grandy, so you're not gonna like. You're probably gonna be like, yeah, criticize him, go for it. We're not really looking at how good the argument actually is or how compelling the information is. We're looking to see if it aligns with our beliefs or not. That's not defensive in praise of Shadow, by the way. I have a lot of issues with many of his arguments. And I know so little about Wendigoon, I can't even comment on it, but even that felt to me a little bit like a massive stretch. But again, I don't know the specifics. I can't talk about that. I don't know what I'm saying. So I'm not going to waste my time with that. What's more interesting is that political ideas are sometimes unintentional. Take Night of the Living Dead. That's like one of the big political films people always talk about with horror. George Romero did not realize he was making a political film until after he saw the finished product.
Dwayne Jones, the actor who played Ben, was very concerned, and almost the only one who was concerned about his being African American. We were going, hey, come on, man, it's 1968. We're all past all of that. Little did we know, right? When we made the first print of the movie, and we were driving it to New York to show it to potential distributors, we heard driving in the car. One of the producers, Russ Striner, and I heard the news on the radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated.
He casted Dwayne Jones not because he was a black man, but because he was the best guy to show up for the role that day at the audition. And because of that, him being black completely recontextualized everything that happened to his character.
When Dwayne agreed to play the role, we didn't change the script. The same things would have happened to him if the actor had been white. The fact that these redneck posse guys shot him, that became racial instead of just a mistaken identity, which is really what we intended. I think that's one of the reasons that people believe to this day that it's important. And in a certain way, it was a mistake.
So again, these are components of historical context and just choices that gave the film more political relevance than Romero intended. And that impacted how he made movies going forward. His later films are way more political because he has more intentionality behind it. Mindy Kaling and Charlie Grandy, I don't know if they were political or if they were just being dumb. For all I know, they were high making those scripts. In fact, they probably were high making these scripts. But that also shows, I can't go into the writer's room. I can't talk to them directly. I mean, I guess I could, but there's no guarantee they'll tell me the truth. I can't prove intentionality, but we can discuss what messages the art communicates. This is an argument I see all the time. Just because art makes a statement does not mean the artist intentionally put that statement in there. Many statements are accidental. A work does not have to be an allegory to communicate an idea. Sometimes people just put messaging in films because that's the way they view the world. Whether or not it's conscious or not, who knows? But that's just what we do. And art is an honest depiction of that viewpoint made manifest, whether we want it to or not. Now, we also have biases. On my channel, I posted a couple of polls. In one, I asked my audience how they felt about conservative films. Here are the results. On another poll, I asked them how they feel about traditional societal values in films. Here's the result. I think they speak for themselves. And yes, a lot of people called me out for being intentionally vague with my phrasing. That was by design. Don't know what to tell you. Kind of wanted it to be vague to make it kind of get your unbiased opinion, but most people were like, hey, dude, why you suck at writing questions? That was the big takeaway. Apparently, I was too vague for my own good. But the point is, when you phrase it as conservative, people are like, oh, it's bad. Conservative, not good, for the most part. But when you phrase it as traditional societal values, people are more positively receptive to that. Much like how people, if you believe certain arguments, that global warming is more frightening of a term than climate change, The way you present a package affects how you interpret that package. And furthermore, let me point this out, America is run by a two-party system and both parties are conservative. Yeah, think about it. The Democrats exist for the status quo. It's news when a Democrat wants to be progressive. Take a look at Hillary Clinton. How long did it take for her to actually push for gay marriage?
I believe that marriage is not just a bond, but a sacred bond between a man and a woman. So I take umbrage at anyone who might suggest that those of us who worry about amending the Constitution are less committed to the sanctity of marriage or to the fundamental bedrock principle that it exists between a man and a woman going back into the mists of history.
How long did it take for any of these Democrats to push for any of these causes?
I believe marriage is between a man and a woman.
I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and so does John Kerry.
Do you support gay marriage? No. Barack Obama nor I support redefining from a civil side what constitutes marriage.
The problem is that America is run by two conservative parties. One is a status quo party, the other is a regressive party. There are no real leftist parties in America. Yet because of our perspective on matters, we deem maintaining the status quo as liberal, when it's really conservative. We are so skewed politically that America is a completely conservative country run by two conservative parties. But if you ask the average Republican, they'll tell you that the Democrats are far left liberals and alt left, when meanwhile the farthest left goes Bernie Sanders. Compared to Europe, he's pretty centrist, or he's liberal. He's liberal. Bernie's liberal. My problem is this. It's not if a horror film's conservative. A lot of them are. The problem is when a horror film is tailor-suited to promote the values of a political party over the values of a person's belief system.
Horror, fantasy has always been a way to, get your views through. They're parables.
I hate it when a horror film is meant to propagate hatred. A message, that's fine. I love messages. Hatred, not so much. Top Gun is a conservative movie. So is God's Not Dead. But I would never compare Top Gun to God's Not Dead. Yet, if I broke it down to just a system of binary, left, right, simple, all-encompassing categories, then Top Gun and God's Not Dead are on the same side, because they both offer traditional conservative values. Top Gun, though, is also one of the gayest movies of the 80s, but I digress. And this is important, We are oversimplifying so much with our media discourse. It's either right or it's left. When in reality, politics is a spectrum. It's a vast array of ideas and different thoughts. It is not simply one side this, one side that. Films like The Exorcist, despite being conservative, resonate with a general horror audience, regardless of where you are on the spectrum. because it tells a human story that's informed by Blatty's political beliefs. But other stories are very left, and they still resonate with a general horror audience. Take, for example, Clive Barker's Cabal, which is adapted in the film Nightbreed. It centers on a society of monsters who break away from the human world to live on their own. I think actually they're pre-human, I think, if I remember correctly, but I digress. The horror of that film is society. They are a revolution, but standard human culture is the problem. And of course, there's also David Cronenberg with a scary mask and a knife. That's also a pretty bad villain. But again, I digress. But even him, he's a symbol of the establishment. He is a therapist. He is meant to put you into a place of normalcy. And he's the bad guy. That's left. Exorcist right. Both have a place in the world. Right-wing horror tends to end whenever the outsider is taken care of. That exterior threat is gone, well, the fears are over, and we can return to the status quo. Whereas leftist horror never forgets the core terror the story presents. So long as the system in place remains, there will be no peace at all.
Can go to